Alright, so here's some stuff that part of my research and involves finding stuff out and then attempting to logically go through the reasonings for certain stuff. Okay. So, one of the things about the FBI index shit is that stuff has always technically operated in an unofficial way outside of the official FBI. So I was wondering why all this psychoness from the FBI about Apple's like encryption stuff. I wondered about that a long time ago. I pulled out essentially what would be hearsay and conjecture potentials of it, and that this is essentially where I attempted to envision why it would be that Apple would be so apprehensive about that, being that they're an American company, being that they're basically a pretty moral and seemingly friendly to government kind of corporation. It seems strange to me, and that my guess is that they potentially would have been approached potentially in like a side clandestine way on attempting to operate or to be housing the FBI index that would have essentially been to be indexing people with Apple devices. And that my guess is that when they finally found out about that or something, that what they would have found out was a bunch of FBI agents on dark webs were doing that, and then what has always been like an insider knowledge only idea would have made its way into a corporation potentially that would be able to hold an intellectual authority over what they're saying. See, if Apple Corporation as an entity informs other people in the government of the operation of FBI agents on dark webs running an FBI index illegally, Apple Corporation would probably be believed about that stuff. And so then the FBI agents basically would have realized that they had just spilled the beans, so to speak. And then they would have started essentially what is their demand to have encryption. Because potentially from that, Apple would have potentially seen what the index exploits are and would have built a stronger encryption against that type of shit on their fucking devices. And that type of shit would have cut off a whole shit ton of FBI indexing through the dark web. And then that would have really snipped the balls of essentially what would be their indexing methodology, and that they essentially probably would have shown, I mean, they have computer scientists there, and that they would have built their encryption to be hardened against the online indexing groups, basically. And that kind of idea then officially the FBI then turns it into a reason that they need the encryption based on drug code or something like that. I mean, that type of stuff, based on the ability of people keeping communication secret from the illegal groups online doing FBI indexing. See, what the FBI groups don't seem to understand is what they're doing was never supposed to be ever acknowledged, okay? They're not supposed to actually be doing that stuff. And so as they start to view that stuff as just like a normal kind of way of being, what they don't realize is that the official stance of the FBI and Christopher Wray and all of them is that you people are operating a legal index. And that essentially it operates as a voyeur, and like it causes exploits to the devices that, and then it violates privacy that becomes a corporate advantage in their profit margin world on their ability of maintaining some decent privacy from that type of shit. Because in the end, they run through dark webs that aren't government dark webs. And that with those exploits comes other people that are exploiting also the devices, and that these would have been the reasons. And that more than likely they would have stayed hush hush at the request of probably the Obama administration about it. And that with that, the FBI would have probably like been so pissed off about it that they would have started their whole legal justification for the needs to that proprietary encryption that gives them their corporate advantage. And see, that's like where, that's the kind of ways, that's how I view that, right? And a lot of that comes from side research, from people online and stuff. And so I like, here's a theoretical kind of idea. I take little ideas or things that I hear that kind of fall into a potential reasoning. I link those together, and then I attempt to build intelligence in all of these that explain certain aspects and timelines and reasonings and stuff like that, that explains the piece of information that I was able to find. And that I usually work through these on my own, and I figure out analysis to what that is and why it ties into a potential. And that's kind of how I come to some of my conclusions are based around that type of, it's like essentially you get data and then you process the stuff, and then you do an analyzation of each one, and then it pulls into a conclusion. And so that is essentially what the AI, investigatory AI, does also. And so one of the things that people forget is that the things that an AI does are usually built out of what a human being does. And so the theoretical approach that I take, DPAC, is essentially the theoretical approach of an investigatory AI. And that all that stuff is always built around what humans already do. And so that is how I come to these conclusions sometimes, like this. And that then it starts to make a logical, reasonable, rational explanation for certain stuff that pulls in and ties into stuff that I find in a data way after I sift through it, so to speak. Then certain things are processed data that then becomes part of the analysis that I formulate a conclusion with. So that's what I do. Right? So this visual aid works for essentially, it's probably a little less organized than this, but you know, it really is like I get a piece of information, that essentially will be part of a conclusion or a question, so to speak, that I'm looking to formulate a conclusion to. And so that is where, I'm a genius. And so that is what I do. But supposedly there's AIs that utilize the same idea or something. And so, that's like, yeah, that's like, I hear some stuff once in a while, and then I attempt to build like what a reasoning for that piece of information would be, and that this is how I compile my information in lots of ways. And a lot of times I feel pretty confidently accurate. And so then there's whole hosts of ways that little pieces of knowledge here and there, little pieces of knowledge sometimes make things a lot more fast-tracked in what my questions and stuff are. Just remember that, like, here's a whole TV show that fits into stuff that I found Kennewick Amazon doing. And that essentially some of those people were observed having a second life inside of the building and then having no recollection of the events that took place in a back room while in there, and then would literally walk out of the building not remembering about being used as a blackmail woman. Sometimes would walk right out right afterward and would literally not remember. And so then the tech psychos around here, they like broadcasted a bunch of those chicks and shit. They did. And so this is where I built a question essentially. And then this Severance TV show then helps with my explanation because people get a really decent visual understanding of the psychology of what was taking place. And so that is kind of like why I've been focused on explaining the severance stuff, because now people have a real visual without having to violate somebody's privacy, without having to use victims and shit. And you don't necessarily need much. It's like kind of like the Terminator 3 where they press the Skynet button. See, all a general would ever need is like, oh, why don't we use this one? And it's like, well, when we press this button in 1998 or something, here's what kind of theoretically happened. And then they don't have to dig through sealed archives and shit. And here's a theoretical similar usage idea that I don't have to use victims and the videos that were taken on them to explain what was happening to people. I can use this TV show as a visual representation and an understanding. And that then people can get a lot of times explaining it with the ability of seeing the TV show that kind of represents the process a little bit. And that helps people get a more comprehensive understanding of the stuff. And that is why since I started watching it, that's why I make comments, because I see, oh yeah, the fucking disco shit. That's it reminds me of oh yeah, shit, the disco shit. And that then seeing the black dude, that also reminds me of other stuff, okay? And that is kind of like where the things that I see in there help with, like, there's finally like a decent visual imagery that's available to anybody, okay? And that then is like the things that I'm seeing in it are like reminding me of certain aspects of my research and stuff like that, okay?